Berlin. David?
Now, and we're back with Grahame Morris and Bruce Hawker. Thank you for standing by. Grahame, we didn't get to hear from you, though, on where the government's at in the opinion polls today. Pretty good. Best they've been for quite some time, despite what we've seen over the last week or so in the Royal Commission into the banks.
Yeah, well, David, it's certainly your backdrop, incidentally, is better flasher than mine. Look, it's the best poll that the government's had since polling day itself. Look, let's have a look over the coming month and have a look. But I think it's what Bruce and I, and even you, have been saying for quite a while, and that is this is still winnable. And I happen to think while ever Bill Shorten is the Labor Party leader, and if the government could stop hammering its own fingers, then this is going to be very close. And yes, the government can win it, but they need a few things to break their way between now and the next election, and they just need to stop making mistakes.
And one other point in this... Sorry. I was going to say, David...
I'm just going to sorry about the delay here. Grahame, I was just going to get your thoughts, Grahame, on the Banking Royal Commission specifically. I mean, yes, it's been a bit messy over the last few days. Have they done enough now to try and satisfy people that they get it, they understand this is a big problem, that they should have gone a lot earlier with a Royal Commission, that they understand that the banks have done wrong and need this inquiry to expose all of that wrongdoing?
Well, I think this is a good example of what I'm talking about, and that is, there should have been a few days ago, look, yeah, we probably should have called the Royal Commission earlier. It was a mistake not to, but we did it at the time because we didn't want to undermine the strength of our own banks and all that sort of stuff. And also, if there's a timeline in all of this, most of this happened in 2010, 2011. But you would think somebody could say, hang on, who was the U-Butte minister on top of these rotten apples at the time? It was Minister Shorten. But have they done enough? No, not yet. And I think as a result of yesterday's interviews a little bit, we're going to have 30 ministers asked to say, are they sorry they didn't bring it forward earlier? But I think Australia's got to remember this, and so are the politicians and the journos. We're not talking about Pol Pot. We're not talking about Idi Amin. We're not talking about Hitler. We are talking about organisations that have 20,000 financial advisors, that's the banks, and obviously you're going to get in there some grubs.
Just keen for your thoughts on it, because, there's no doubt that some of the behaviour that's been exposed is really worrying, is appalling, but some of the language around it, atrocities and so on. We do need to remember that the banks are important to our financial foundations in Australia.
Well, indeed, but I think what they do need to do is really determine whether the people that we're seeing in the witness boxes now are really patsies in a way, or whether this is actually a much more systemic, institutionalised way of dealing with the public that the banks have been engaging in. If that becomes the main message that comes out of the Royal Commission, then that's very damaging for the banks, and I think we'll see even more calls for reining them in. But to some extent, what Grahame says is right. The problem, though, I think that the government has with this is that they don't seem to engage in wargaming, and by that I mean they don't try to put themselves in the shoes of the opposition or other critics and say, well, if I was them, what would I be thinking about saying now? How do I get ahead of what they're saying? And try to preempt those sorts of attacks. That is a very important part of the political game, if you like, between the government and the opposition that's traditionally engaged in. You have to try to get ahead of the other side, think about what they're going to say, preempt what they're going to say if you can, and come out with your own position. If you can do that, then you can see off a lot of this stuff. The problem is that they do seem to be a rather flat-footed government.
Now, the final one, the pre-budget preparations. Not ideal, I suppose, that the Prime Minister is spending 10 days, better part of 2 weeks abroad in the lead-up to the budget. He has spent some of his time here, I know, yesterday, locked away on the phone and no doubt with Matthias Cormann in an expenditure review committee meeting. But Grahame, you know, governments need to prepare the ground for a budget, even if it's not going to be full of nasties. If there are some goodies, you need to frame in people's minds, don't you, what to expect in the budget so that you'll have a much better chance of selling them and convincing them that you're delivering and that you have a plan. How do you think the government is going with its pre-budget phase in the next couple of weeks?
It's a little all over the place, isn't it? It's sort of hard. It is sort of hard when the boss has got to be overseas for a few days, but he had to, and plus he's got Anzac Day, and that's really important. But yes, look, where we're at the moment is that it's not going to be a Santa Claus budget, but I don't think the government could really start saying, hey, it's going to be a slash and burn budget. So I suspect it'll be, you know, Captain Reasonable, a year out from election, some goodies, but also some interesting figures there, and particularly today, as it looks as if some of the economic figures might be a fraction better than we thought. So the economic story for the government might be a little better than we thought.
Yeah, and look, if we do inch closer and closer to getting back into surplus as we get into this budget and then closer to the election, Bruce, that's going to be a pretty important story for the government as well.
Well, it will be, but I don't think they really have come up with a story yet. I mean, surpluses and, you know, economic crises and budget crises and things like that of the past disappear and then something else comes along. I mean, this is not a government that people look at and say, oh, they're great economic managers. It's interesting because that's usually the Conservatives' strong suit, but it just hasn't happened with this government. And we just saw it the other day with McCormack coming out and saying that it was a Santa budget or whatever. You know, I think it probably will be a very generous budget because it's the last budget before the next election. And so they're not going to go in there with a cut and slash approach to the budget. They're going to have a very generous one. But I don't think that they've communicated that internally at all. Well, it goes back to the earlier point, you know, well, think about what the other side are going to say and try to get in ahead of it. And they just don't seem to be doing that at all. They're not great communicators.
Yeah. Well, we shall see if that improves. Bruce, Grahame, we'll catch up next week. Thanks so much for joining us and thanks for bearing with us some of the lost connection there along the way. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with the last word.